Notes on Immanence and Nominalism in Postmodern Theoretical Discourse from Fredric Jameson's Postmodernism or the Cultural Logic of Late Capitalism, Part 2, Deconstruction as Nominalism. Jameson identifies in the movement, if it may be called one, of post-structuralism, an umbrella term as it may be, a tendency to occasionally be exasperated by historical thinking. Yet this is often drawing our own insight away from what he identifies as perhaps its more pertinent, in the lack of a better word, tendency. That is, its tireless rooting out of diachronic thought, a tendency which, to my mind, can have woefully statist and reactionary consequences. Jameson does recognize this, and in seeing static and stationary objects as merely that, questions whether this is even a form of thinking, going as far as to suggest that synchronic thought is where the last classical vocations of philosophy vanish. Paradoxically, perhaps as a result of the onslaught on diachronic thought, it becomes coterminous with philosophy. To present his position, I would like to quote: if post-structuralism, or as I prefer, theoretical discourse, is at one with the demonstration of the necessary incoherence and impossibility of all thinking, then by virtue of the very persistence of its critiques of the diachronic, and by way of the targeting mechanism itself, which continually forms temporal and historical conceptualities positioned at the center of its objective, the attempt to think history in however confused or internally contradictory a fashion at length becomes identified with the very vocation of thought itself. In this quotation, I would like to point out the phrase which consistently finds temporal and historical conceptualities positioned at the center of its objective. This to me sounds very much like the Foucauldian concept of the episteme as a historically noticeable conceptual structure that may be witnessed homologically in disciplines. To be clear here, Foucault is using terms more akin to his work would describe an episteme as that apparatus which makes possible the separation not of the true from the false, but rather of what may or may not be characterized as scientific. This formulation, even within the Foucauldian conception of disciplinary apparatuses and power knowledge, would appear to me to hinge principally on the reproducibility of a finding and hence its falsifiability. In returning to deconstruction, however, what may be the chief features or gestures of this procedure in thought? Two broadly are identified. One, an attempt to isolate the intent of an act as an act which necessarily entails a reading. Two, to separate from an act what may crudely be described as its later historical embellishments, restoring to itself, as it were, the crudeness of its emergent generalizations. In other words, it would mean returning to the act of thinking as practice and stripping away the reifications that sediment around the act when it has become an object. This isolation of the initial gesture or expression of a thinker are, however, often not merely an episteme or the structurality of structures, as it were, but rather the conditions of their possibility or their historical schema, as it were. And we do find that this in Paul DeMann, author of The Resistance to Theory. In his work, the difference between the Enlightenment and Romanticism still remain in force, as do the distinction between Romanticism and Modernism. These periodizations, as it were, call for a historical specificity which requires contextualizations to be made, if only to allow for parallels to be drawn between epochs. The relationship of the 18th century to transition debates, bourgeois revolution, and the relationship of state power to capitalism being what Jameson points to as a relative unfamiliarity in DeMann. On reading Jameson and his consideration of deconstruction, it is important to note perhaps the only defining principle that I can think of as to why this literary or interpretive practice chose to downplay, when not ignore, historically rooted arguments, and that has to do with its uses. How are we to think of narrative or relatability between two or more distinct, though not necessarily discrete, modes of production, perhaps more familiar to pre revolutionary Europe than anything the New World has seen? Also evident in moments of cultural contact, such as the American involvement in the Middle East. Here, in such encounters, history is not a useful register or plane to draw from. Precedents, to use a juridical idiom, are presented when not performed, with an attention to what is live in a situation, not cited with the authority of a diktat or pronouncement. Literary criticism has long and perhaps classically so included rhetoric amidst its ambit of study, and political oration, or rather its performativity, on platforms, which is what it today is effectively reduced to, is where we are, as it would hence be a critique of such assemblages from where we would have to begin. It was the dawning of such an understanding which incited Baudrillard's text, "The Gulf War did not take place." Indeed, it was this willingness to set aside the facts to make room for reason that endears Rousseau, perhaps the only figure from the Enlightenment readily adopted by liberals and progressives, to Paul DeMann. In a gesture, I might add, which echoes a perverted inverse of what was Kant's plea to the Kaiser, that he sought to use reason to make room for faith. In his appraisal of Rousseau's account on the origin of language, however, Jameson seems to rather disparagingly elbow Rousseau out of the way. The problem is that Rousseau has talked himself so powerfully into the proof that language could never have come into being in the first place that he must break off in embarrassment, since it obviously did. That's the quote. Perhaps due to an inadequacy in my reading, what I glean to be Rousseau's intent, and indeed why he cannot pin down an origin to language, is rather because he chose to represent their conditions of possibility and, of course, their motivations. Reading the original here, as in many cases, would be advised. On another note, where Jameson is truer is his identification of passions that are conceived as pathological needs in Rousseau's essay. And with this, of course, comes their valorization, perhaps even vulgarized in terms of pleasure and pain. Yet, regarding the history of deconstruction, particularly as it may be remembered in the American Academy, a crucial difference is marked between the position adopted by DeMann and that of Derrida. DeMann, for instance, characterizes the state of nature as a fiction, Rousseau's political philosophy as a set of promises, and his narratives of his own past as a set of excuses. Analogically, Jameson points out that to think of the Constitution of the United States as a promise, for example, however defamiliarizing such a gesture may be, invisibilizes, so to speak, the force of institutions and of Althusser's ideological state apparatuses. Fiction, perhaps the most modern abode of the literary theorist, becomes oddly antiquated amidst Baudrillardian simulacra and image society theory. Indeed, as far as the ability of words and narratives to be compelling to us, even psychoanalysis would attest to the force which fantasy and the imaginary have, often superseding reality and reason. And indeed, in historiography, where various empirical pasts are often no more compelling than Rousseau's fictions. Fiction and even irony remain operative categories in DeMann, just as they are foregone by Derrida. Derrida's own focus is admittedly less a focus on the fictionality of the experience of the past as on the internal contradictions of its formulation. This tracing of internal contradiction, as it were, appears to be working backwards via its archaeology of the failures of language to a place where it may have once emerged from early hominids. This is where the emphasis on such seemingly dramatic categories such as the rupture or scream gain their discursive conceptuality in Derrida, who carefully plies apart the unsaid premises supporting ready interpretations. The scene presented is one where a person who possesses speech or writing is forced to imagine a situation using and depicted by these two properties what their absence may entail, perhaps akin to the history of breakdowns in communication. Yet each new form, temporality, genre, and indeed interpretation brings with it a seemingly narrative altering difference, which, when left unrecorded, unarchived, renders the past inaccessible and hence unimaginable. The question which we literary theorists should ask, however, concerning judgments even in an aesthetic register, is what is the mechanism via which viewpoints, romantic, modernist, etc., become ideologies, that is, as aesthetic judgments or tastes which are socially prescribed or censured. The concept which DeMann offers and works with here is metaphor, that is, metaphors that have lost their metaphoricity in the sense of irony produced by the difference between the subject of enunciation and the subject that is enunciated. becoming hence ultimately mere denominations, if not dead categories. This produces, as it were, the presentation of ideologies as fixated metaphors, hence schema on its way to becoming doxa, is far removed from the Rousseau who seeks to present the genesis of the process of abstraction itself. Quote, the repeated contact between man and various entities, and between the entities themselves, must necessarily engender in the mind of man the perception of relationship. End of quote. To which Jameson adds, such relationships, first comparison, long, small, short, weak, and then number itself, mark the birth of true conceptualization and abstraction, or, if you prefer, of an abstraction that grasps itself as such, unlike nomination, which still purports to respect the particular and not to compare. To frame this differently, concepts, as it were, make possible comparison. And this would be true even when dealing with quantitative magnitudes. Two trees of different sizes, for instance, would not be comparable without first positing their conceptual equivalence, or at least resemblance. Indeed, it would appear that it is only within this domain of comparability that the reign of the name ends, and that of the word, the concept, abstraction, and the universal begins. DeMann, we are told, identifies this transformation as the operation of metaphor. In terms of vision, or rather in terms of visions which are comparable to that of DeMann's, we are guided to Adorno, whose own project of negative dialectics, in its featuring of the tyranny of the concept, and by extension, reason, in its imposition on the heterogeneous, a likening gesture, is itself comparable, as it were, to Derridian deconstruction. These two projects, as it were, that of deconstruction and negative dialectics, are themselves set up or constructed very differently, notwithstanding the similitude presented above. Observing this difference, however, would require us to adjourn the ontological priority of language over consciousness. Jameson, however, does read a greater internal narrativity in DeMann that than anything like the external narrativity in the dialectic of enlightenment. A differentiation, if I might add, would be tempting to question. What this external narrativity is likened to is the alleged enlightenment mastery over nature in Adorno and Horkheimer. Adorno, perhaps in the legacy, critical or otherwise, of that break, feels able to reconstruct an external historical narrative which can account for the emergence of abstraction, a step which you will find he shares with Rousseau. Rousseau himself, in a text such as The Social Contract, does much to raise issues which would be championed by the Jacobins. For Marxians, the importance of this text is in broaching issues such as the dictatorship of the proletariat and the need to project a vision of a more advanced socialist democracy beyond bourgeois forms of parliamentary representation is alluded to. Instead of getting into debates of comparative political philosophy, however, Jameson does pay heed to DeMann's suggestion to sort through the text's linguistic tissues or values, without which, we are told, the social contract would remain incomprehensible. In returning to the title of this section, however, Deconstruction is Nominalism, our attention is finally brought to the overlap between Marxism and DeMannian deconstruction, which Marxists probably recognize as the theory of value. In Capital itself, Jameson does point out that the whole question of the form of value remains hidden, quote, behind the even more mysterious phenomena of equivalence, constituting, as it were, the possibility of exchange value and the substitution of one object for another different one. Use value, as it were, marking our existential relationship to unique things, drops out in the first pages of Capital, as it is not in that sense subject to the law of value or of equivalence. End of quote. In framing this within the parlance of contemporary criticism, Jameson would assert that use value is the realm of difference and differentiation, whereas exchange value will come to be described as the realm of identities. Marx at this point, hence, would equate value with exchange value. Regarding value itself, however, or its conception, Jameson would differentiate between the four stages of value in Capital and Adam Smith's labor theory of value. It is the other dimension to this, however, or other face, if you will, in which we would see and recognize production, grounding the market and exchange, culminating in the emergence of money. The function of a metaphor, as we all may know, is to represent the likeness between two unlike things, or, if you prefer, to represent one thing in terms of another. As Jameson puts it, the mystery consists in trying to fathom what a pound of salt could possibly have in common with three hammers, and in what way it makes sense to affirm of them that they are somehow the same. This lays the stage for a rather different problem of the production of new value, which is to be his central concern later in Capital. The position of equivalence, hence, is not is a non-mediated in a non-mediated sense is not thinkable, or at least not articulated in Capital by Marx. This at least is Jameson's reading of it. In characterizing Rousseau's discourse, two essential principles are identified: the identity of the object and the apprehension that the other person is somehow the same as myself. We are alerted to how DeMann's own reading of Rousseau may entail conflating our relation to objects with our relation to people. Indeed, this is a tendency which has been noticed by even more contemporary transatlantic criticism, i.e., the personification of capital. In terms of Marx's approach here, read by Jameson, he has this to say: that we do not build up complex ideas out of simple ones, but rather the other way around. that it is the intuition of the complex form that gives us the key to grasping the simpler one. In another vulgarity, we hear philosophical and linguistic abstraction is itself an effect and byproduct of exchange. And here I must object to ask, why not of the process or indeed mode of production? And the answer would be because this would in itself, at this stage, not feature as a process of exchange, but perhaps as a narratorial process. The fact that this is not an exchange per se, but rather a productive process, means that the forms of temporality in question is not reversible. Citing Marx's example, the linen expresses its value in the coat. The coat serves as the material in which that value is expressed. To put it differently, this is the process that exchange presupposes. Jameson likens the way the coat and the linen are said to be the same, and even the irreversibility of it, to DeMann's account of the generation of narrative out of metaphor, and the subsequent allegorical forms that result from that structural tendency. The temporality presented in this reading, however, is not necessarily real, lived, or existential time, nor of historical time either, nor is it so by implication. It is possible, we are told, of reading Marx's account of the four forms of value as a genealogical narrative, continuing, or in a historical way. The subsequent forms in question are described, barring the first, as that entails the use of the material to make the commodity in question, even if it is a service. As such, it is not an equivalence per se, but a transformation. It appears here that Jameson begins by presenting the subsequent step of exchange proper, where, for instance, salt, which has no value in a tribe, is traded for metal. When such a comparative moment is drawn within an autarkic social formation, new equivalents are posited, seizing on a great range of objects. These seem to be other equivalents, the moment a mediatory medium facilitates the transaction between two objects. Here, apart from the first step which Jameson appears to skip, jumping to exchange itself, where the actual transformation of a material into a commodity, for example, is posited, termed by Marx the elementary form of value, we find the determination of the relative magnitudes of value also left out, as this would be of more interest to an economist. The transactionary moment, however, and its various mediatory mechanisms, credit, money, rent, deeds, and titles, enable, as we have presented, a range of polyvalent equivalences. Jameson describes it as a kind of infinite and infinitely provisional chain of equivalences that course through the object world of a social formation. In this world, if you notice, of the exchange and polyvalence of objects, what was once thought to be irreversible, inasmuch as how a commodity or service is rendered, becomes reversible, but in terms of its transactional equivalence. And I guess where Jameson is going with this is the spatializing of temporality, reversing it, as it were, in terms of presence at least, the issue of irreversibility. Prior to the institutionalization of the law of value, its solidification in a medium, this description corresponds to what Baudrillard terms symbolic exchange, the interminable chain of exchanges to be standardized and its inexhaustibility to be quantified forces the thinking and appearance of the general form of value to seal the uniformity of the process of production. This new object expresses the values of the rest of the world of commodities through one single kind of commodity set apart from the world. Evans Pritchard, the anthropologist, notices the adoption of cows by the Nuer for this function. We are also informed that Gayatri Spivak has proposed that we rethink the formation of the literary canon in terms of a dialectic of the stages of value, a notion which some metaphysicians may find interesting, if not troubling. Fredric Jameson himself, however, does attest that he would be tempted to correlate this third stage of equivalences, where an inner worldly object comes to do double duty as the nascent universal equivalent with the symbol and symbolic moment of thought. This may be witnessed on the cultural front with the endowment of artistic representation of a worldview with a kind of universal force. This gesture may perhaps even retain a sense of its experimental polyvalence via the simulation of literary styles in an older work, creating perhaps some of the signature works of the modernist avant garde, with James Joyce's Ulysses serving as an example. There are worrying signs of this, however, as with the diminution of any direct use value cited, with the process of production and its mode, as it were, not being a live totality, what we are left with at some level is the disappearance of narrative, and what Fredric Jameson has elsewhere cited as a reduction of time to the present. Perhaps in this light, we may better appreciate Fredric Jameson's words in this book published in 1991. Quote, "What follows then will not only be an abstraction, it will be allegory, and a desperate effort to reach the concept which necessarily fails, and thereupon marks itself as a failure in order to succeed despite itself." Yet within the form of mechanical reproduction prevalent in our late capitalist society, and were the singularity of a form in terms of its preponderance at least to be insisted on, we may be well advised by Guy Debord's formulation of the image as the final form of commodity reification, citing the Society of the Spectacle. And we are pointed out to the relevance of this theory to contemporary society, media, and apparently postmodernism itself, which is encompassedly knit. At this point, the only possible meeting point between DeMann's exploration of the consequences of the inaugural metaphorical moment and Marx's staging of the emergence of value would be in the affinity opened up between the former's textuality and the more postmodern concerns of the dynamics of media signification. Yet without this individuated narrative, we are left to piece together genealogical reconstructions apparent in Marx's work on the stages, or should I say, forms of value. Darstellung, however, determinative as it may be, does not yield an account of its own genesis. As for Marx's critique, however, of political economy as we readily understand it, we are told that it has a value comparable to language itself, a dynamic which Levi-Strauss would notice, being as it is a system and not an index of abbreviated interruptions. Paul DeMann does not insist on staging the drama of the universal and the particular, as in Rousseau's The Social Contract, having himself moved on to the interdeterminacy of legal language. A tension is alluded to between the constitutive and the performative. We are told that grammatical logic can function only if its referential consequences are disregarded. A quote from Allegories of Reading. We are warned, however, that it is more difficult following Rousseau to redescend from the universality of law on the level of the general will to the contingent decisions whereby that law is adjusted to specific conflicts, which include referential circumstances. Jameson registers a missed encounter here with Marxism, which he believes would have led to some scrutiny of the relationship between economic abstraction, value, and the other abstract and universal instance, which is the state or the general will. Political rhetoric of any kind is often built on fixations to certain demands, and these are often what feature in the field of value. In any of these situations, it is not the fixation itself that is the goal, but rather the comprehension of how such an objective may further a cause. As such, a perfunctory role of criticism is to weed out errors, illusions, and misrecognitions, as perhaps has been customary with ideological critique. Here, we should willingly comprehend that it is only a radical transformation of the social system, and by extension, history itself, that the possibility of thinking new kinds of thoughts and concepts arise. This, as you can imagine, remains foreclosed in any synchronous system, such as perhaps DeMann's view of language. The notion of value in the economic sphere, while subject to changes, is an abstraction that is historical and institutional, redirecting our critique of abstraction. Indeed, so much of what we deem progress often turns out to be mere repetition. We are presented, however, in DeMann, in whose reading of Rousseau the birth of allegory may be witnessed out of the primal metaphoric dilemma. Jameson does attest that DeMann is at the very least post-contemporary in his belief that a transcendent theory is undesired and undesirable. He adds that it is not the aim in itself, but rather a conceptual distance that allows a reader the apprehension of a language. At the level of reading, we can hence see two levels operating. one of the speech act itself, be they promises or excuses, and allegories of figures which may possibly be drawn from or are immanent to them. This, at least, is DeMann's effort in Allegories of Reading, to present a mediatory code that may encompass personal life and history itself. Such a gesture is identified by Jameson to be a form of dialectical narrative. Contemporary criticism has been faced with the problem of reflexivity and its staging in such scenarios, particularly post the phenomenological notion of the self having been problematized. With this is also noted the temptation to turn it back into a form of self consciousness. What is valorized here, to use a term which has perhaps been appropriated as the subaltern left's version of objectified, is of course self consciousness. Yet, whether this is a legitimate charge and whether it takes cognizance of dialectical narratives, such as in Hegel's Moments, for instance, where something very different seems to be occurring, is a question left open. Perhaps in the same vein, Jameson adds that the loss of consciousness or even self consciousness would not necessarily be fatal for agency. This, I think, is an unavowable position, as the infringement on the self under conditions of surveillance capitalism, for instance, would work precisely by instrumentalizing agency against self consciousness, nullifying its field, as it were. And here we would be well reminded to recall the corporations referred to earlier. Regarding the issue of nominalism alongside deconstruction, headlining this section as it is, there seems to be a tendency, dangerously articulated though perhaps useful, put forth in these ways. 1. Derrida, the interminability of interpretability. 2. Spivak, the impossibility of a full undoing, which Jameson observes meets the problem of self consciousness head on by acknowledging it as a necessarily thwarted aim and drive. Here, I think what is crucial is not vital, if not vital, is the possibility of nomination, which surely must be the foundation of any nominalism. The question then becomes, to me at least, as to how this nomination is to be bracketed, i.e., as a sensory perception, recollection, or projection, etc. Inasmuch as nomination can be bracketed, this set, consisting of our framing and the nomination, would necessarily be incomplete were we to think our act of bracketing, that is, our nomination, or rather demarcation of nomination, to be truly subjective. Alain Badiou makes this point differently, drawing from set theory, which explains why a null set is a subset of any set, philosophically interpreting this as incompleteness as such. DeMann, we read, was an 18th century mechanical materialist. This statement, I assume, is made regarding the origin of language and theories of its conception, where I gather that, following Herder, he would see a situation where language doesn't exist and try to deduce how it may have come about, a kind of logic not entirely alien to deconstruction, which Jameson adds is as closely related to Marxian ideological analysis as Islam is to Christianity. DeMann himself, in his reading of Rousseau's Profession, presents a displacement of the idea of good out of notions concerning theism and to the faculty of judgment, or rather to its act. Though DeMann might argue that it was Rousseau himself, reflecting much of his Enlightenment brethren's horror of religion, who does this. Yet were we to follow the argument that it is the deconstructive reader himself who does this, would be to recognize our old friend, the metaphoric act, and the linguistic affirmation of resemblance and identity. Regarding Rousseau's Profession itself, however, these linguistic and conceptual forms are not argued for inasmuch as their conditions or of possibility are investigated into. We are told that this may make the text into a pre-Kantian one, from what would otherwise have been neo-Cartesian. Let me repeat this. Regarding Rousseau's Profession itself, however, these linguistic and conceptual forms are not argued for inasmuch as their conditions of possibility are investigated into. We are told that this may make the text into a pre-Kantian one from what would otherwise have been neo-Cartesian. Regarding the presentation of the DeMannian reading of Rousseau, I would here insist that you read the original. In terms of Rousseau's engagement with religion, however, despite accounting for it in his Profession of Faith of the Savoyard Vicar, does seem to subtract from the tradition of revelation in Christianity and Judaism, and in this sense may be interpreted as pessimistic or, as some may like, nihilistic. As a trait, this may be apparent or rather transferred to DeMann himself, inasmuch as I suppose as Rousseau is read via allegories of reading. DeMann's affinities, however, probably do have an earlier link or precedent, if you prefer, in Kant, whose own likeness to Rousseau, as Enlightenment philosophers go, is characterized. And while its most outward and recognized appearance may have been the horror of religion, philosophically it finds voice in the very Kantian distinction between the thing as it is for us and the thing in itself, or phenomena and noumena. Here, and perhaps unlike the direction of focus in later philosophical figures, Kant's focus on noumena, or the thing itself, independent of our perception, is where we may find a correspondence to the uncanny and with the atomistic visions of earlier philosophy. The significance of this moment for philosophy cannot be overstated, for it was this break between Kant and Hegel, if it can be reduced to a signpost between proper names, that a figure as contemporary as Zizek claims that philosophy becomes self-conscious of itself and formally begins. To be clear, this is not exactly Jameson's view of it, not explicitly the vision of his own project, which, following Marx and Freud, he may like to call theory. Yet the break, as it were, has already been opened, the point of impossibility touched. For after Kant, all subsequent philosophy attempted to represent things in itself, as it were. This, in science as in the arts, is subject to the development of new technologies, and film may perhaps be a defining one for our generation. Here, the ability to visualize our process of abstraction, as it were, is rendered pictorially, and this has rather spectacular possibilities for our imagining of the matter. Though we would be well advised to recall that this is not an entirely new phenomena, and that everyone from Sartre to perhaps more recently with object-oriented ontology, championed by Graham Harman, has confronted it. Though Jameson here cites Stanley Cavell, I'm not sure how you pronounce it. The cinematographic process, however, does present the chance to render the nomina depictable in a properly filmic Unheimlichkeit or uncanniness. And here Kubrick's early work, such as the shot of the flight through dimensions in 2001, A Space Odyssey, serves as a milestone. Can we identify in this the longing of the early materialists who sought to gaze into the very pores of matter? Yet Jameson also marks the Hegelian break with Kant, which I alluded to earlier, characterized here as that deeper level of Hegelian essence, that truer dimension beneath phenomenal appearance, into which Marx invites us on leaving the marketplace. And perhaps now would be when we should add the injunction that perhaps Marx's hidden abode of production, be it the factory floor, the artisan studio, or his own dwelling, is not the same as Hegelian phenomenology, in whose light and whose staunchest critics perhaps came to represent as a philosophy of the encounter. The abode, as it were, is not one which corresponds to Kant's things in themselves or Rousseau's vicar, since we are told that they contribute to categories beyond anthropomorphism, or what is here before us or without us. What Jameson does bring forth, however, is the dualistic world which Kant presents, where human appearance coexists and is impossibly superimposed with an unthinkable and non-human world of things in themselves. And this is said to present a useful set of coordinates for DeMann, whose linguistic categories replace Kant's cognitive ones. This gesture, as it were, also closes the door to Rousseau's theistic solution. We are finally guided, as it were, to where DeMann is not an 18th century materialist, inasmuch as he is no longer seeking to determine an origin, I presume, even though Jameson does not explicitly state this. It is entailed in his casting aside of the effort to make a link between the universal and the particular, which might have been, alas, Rousseau's final religious gesture. Having said this, he is not relegated to the cardboard box of nihilism, a bracketing which does have its votaries, but is rather said to be a nominalist, a position whose reference to the object of representation, to me at least, is not clarified in any discreteness from the subject who may see it that way. We are reminded that modern art almost certainly engages with this logic of nominalism, a study which, among others, Adorno has pursued. It is possible in the reading presented before us to think of DeMann as something of a restorationist or archivist. In Fredric Jameson's words, a last-minute rescue operation and a salvaging of the aesthetic, even a defense and valorization of literary study. End of quote. This, we are told, is secured via a strategic redefinition of the concept of a text, and we are provided an inkling of what they may be in reference to when we see a distinction marked between two basic types of writing: allegories of figure and allegories of reading. Expelled from the Demannian aesthetic valorization are the ideologists Herder and Schiller, who are blissfully unendowed with such ideas. Regarding the distinction between modernity and postmodernity, terms which serve a periodizing function put in place by Jameson, it is observed where DeMann's own approach, i.e., his philosophical view of language, would differ. Perhaps not unlike Baudrillard, we would witness the use of temptation and seduction conceptually, and this is where his work would intersect with the above cited movements, even if he were not to agree with the terms. And this gesture can be witnessed in his disposition towards romanticism and modernity as such, between which he would be inclined to mark a continuity rather than a radical break. In terms of figures of analysis, Rilke is taken up in Allegories of Reading, where we see something like the giving way of great philosophical poems to a sparser verse, which would appear to foreshadow Celan. DeMann, in his own terms, would seem to privilege the spoken word when he says that sound is the only property immanent to language. This phonetic primacy in his ascesis, as it were, mediating between formal peculiarity and Rilke's religious thematics. This, however, does coincide with the reification and the separation of the senses in modern times, which also paves way for their autonomization, perhaps best exemplified in modern painting. In this melee of sensorial perception, what deconstruction's chief critical gesture is to be are identifications and unmaskings of linguistic seductions. What this phonetic isolation does usher forth, however, in a morality which Jameson claims is prophetic of the 80s, is a declaration of bankruptcy on themes such as liberation, the body, desire, and the senses, which were one of the principal gains made through the battlefield of the 60s. So far, Jameson has avoided remarks on DeMann's complicity with the Germans during their occupation of Belgium as a cultural journalist. We are pointed out to a possible overstatement of this feature, as North American intellectuals generally haven't had any correlative experience of the choices of people under military occupation. Also, their focus on anti-Semitism ignores the other prominent feature of the Nazi period, namely anti-communism. Jameson would say, however, that DeMann was neither an anti-communist nor a right-winger. He does, however, detect a certain period corporatism operating in the background across his texts, which are devoid of any personal originality. As an apolitical aesthete, he would appear to be a very different figure from Heidegger, who genuinely believed that the Hitlerian seizure of power would usher forth a genuine national revolution. Their twin scandals may have been raised simultaneously however, to delegitimate Derridian deconstruction. In his reactionary spirit, however, Heidegger did much to purge Freiburg University of its doubtful elements, although there were very few radical leftists in the university system those days. In his mythopoetics, he may have failed to understand Hitler's his pragmatist position as a centrist and his relation to big businesses. Heidegger's turn, however, of his existentialism to matters of being may coincide with what Vargos Llosa describes as the self-censorship one installs upon being burnt by history. In his case, upon being beaten up after a political demonstration with students, and how this fosters an avoidance of any future political commitment. Regarding DeMann's anti-Semitic article, Jameson recognizes it as commonly misread, that it is an expression of anti-Semitism rather than its undermining. It is suggested that his deconstructive turn may well have been a calculated attempt to undo this disaster by forming readers capable of nuanced interpretation, hence avoiding such vulgarities. And that would conclude our chapter on immanence, nominalism, or immanence and deconstruction. I forget how precisely it's titled. Immanence and Nominalism, from Jameson's book Postmodernism and the Cultural Logic of Late Capitalism. I think it might have been one of the largest chapters in the book. So if I were to, in any case, go through any of the other sections, it would never be this long. Having said this, I think the reason it was necessary to take this up is because the figures and the questions and the logics which it engages with are very much live, fortunately or unfortunately, even today in the university system. Not to mention um, popular culture, cinema, politics, and the world at large. And yet, very often, they seem to be not mere rehashings, but sometimes deliberate misreadings of earlier movements. And very often, they tend to play off each other in ways which are not entirely transparent to a lay reader. As such, I do offer Jameson's account as a informed perspective which can actually glean through some of the embellishments which the deconstructive school, which found its firmest foothold in the Yale School of Deconstruction since perhaps the 60s or 70s. I think it was in the mid 60s that Derrida was actually formally invited to Yale. And of course, later on, you have students and people from India going there. Spivak, of course, being the most noted amongst them. And this, in some ways, contextualizes their studies and movements and the grounds of their analysis in ways that very few other figures, if any at all, would care to. And for your time and patience, I would thank you. And as always, I shall leave a copy of the text in the description itself, which I would always recommend. Thank you again. Goodbye.